I threw the Congressional Medal of Honor across my living room like it was a piece of burning coal. The gilded star hit my mantelpiece and clattered to the floor, coming to rest beside a faded photograph of 30 young soldiers who would never see home again. The irony wasn't lost on me, 54 years after that blood-soaked morning in Vietnam, and they wanted to pin a medal on the chest of the man who killed them all. "Mr. Kowalski, this is the highest honor our nation can bestow," Senator Matthews had said just hours earlier, his voice dripping with political honey. "Your heroic actions on March 15, 1970, saved 17 Vietnamese children from certain death. You're a national hero." Hero. The word tasted like copper pennies and napalm. My hands shook as I poured 3 fingers of bourbon, the same brand I'd been drinking for 5 decades to wash away the screams. Outside my Denver apartment, news vans circled like vultures. I'd refused the ceremony, refused the interviews, refused to play their patriotic theater. But they wouldn't let it die. The phone rang. Again. Frank Kowalski speaking. "Mr. Kowalski, this is Jessica Chen from the Washington Post. I'm calling about—" I hung up. They'd been calling for weeks, ever since some Pentagon desk jockey had discovered my overlooked heroism while digitizing old files. Overlooked. Christ, if they only knew how carefully it had been buried. The bourbon burned, but not as much as the memories clawing their way to the surface. March 15, 1970. Firebase Charlie. The day I learned that sometimes doing the right thing means destroying everything you've ever believed in. I was a sergeant then, 22 years old, and stupid enough to think the world was painted in clear lines of right and wrong. My squad was part of Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison's unit, a man who wore his West Point ring like a shield and quoted Sun Tzu while cleaning his sidearm. Morrison was everything I wanted to become: honorable, decisive, unbreakable. That morning started like any other in that green hell. The intelligence report said the village of Phu Bai was clear, just farmers and their families trying to survive another day in a war that had swallowed their country whole. But intelligence was wrong more often than a broken clock. We were 3 clicks out when Morrison's radio crackled to life. I was close enough to hear the transmission, close enough to see his face drain of color. "Blackbird 6, this is Eagle's Nest. Abort mission." "Repeat, abort mission. Return to base immediately." Morrison stared at the radio like it had sprouted fangs. Around us, the jungle hummed with that particular silence that meant death was watching. "Sir?" I'd asked. He looked at me with eyes that had suddenly aged a decade. "Frank, sometimes following orders is the hardest thing a soldier can do." But we didn't follow orders. Instead, Morrison made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. He ordered us forward, his jaw set like granite. "There are civilians in that village," he said. "Children. Intel was wrong before. It's wrong again." He was right. We found 17 children huddled in a schoolhouse, while Viet Cong fighters used the village as a staging ground for an ambush. The enemy had been waiting for us, but they hadn't expected us to arrive early. They hadn't expected us to ignore the abort order. The firefight lasted 47 minutes. I know because I counted every second while bullets carved chunks out of the schoolhouse walls and children sobbed in a language I didn't understand, but somehow felt in my bones. Morrison fought like a man possessed, drawing fire away from the foe. Schoolhouse, coordinating our defense with the precision of a chess master. He saved those children with his tactical brilliance and his willingness to sacrifice everything for people who would never know his name. A sniper's bullet found him during the 39th minute. I watched the light fade from his eyes as he pressed a blood-soaked envelope into my hands. "The children, Frank," he whispered. "Get them out. And Frank, the orders, the abort orders. They can't know. Promise me." I promised. God help me, I promised. We extracted the children and returned to base with 17 saved lives and 1 flag-draped coffin. Morrison was posthumously awarded the Silver Star. His widow, pregnant with their first child, received it at a ceremony. I attended in dress blues that felt like a costume. The official report stated that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had died heroically while following intelligence reports about enemy activity in Pubai. No mention was made of the abort order. No mention was made of his decision to disobey direct commands. Morrison's reputation remained pristine, his legacy unblemished. The envelope he'd given me contained his real report, the one that told the truth about that day. In it, he took full responsibility for the decision to ignore the abort order. He detailed his reasoning, his assessment of the tactical situation, and his willingness to face court-martial for saving civilian lives. He'd written it to protect his men, to protect me. For 54 years, I'd kept that envelope in a safety deposit box, along with my silence. Morrison's son, James Jr., had followed his father's footsteps to West Point and beyond, eventually becoming a general himself. His daughter became a prominent advocate for veterans' rights. Their lives were built on the foundation of their father's heroic reputation. Now they wanted to give me a medal for that day. They wanted to celebrate my heroism without understanding that every act of courage casts a shadow, and sometimes the shadow swallows everything good about the light. The doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Jessica Chen from the Post, her notepad ready, her eyes hungry for the story that would make her career. Behind her, camera crews jockeyed for position like hyenas at a kill. I opened the door. "Ms. Chen, you're persistent." She smiled the way journalists smile when they smell blood in the water. "Mr. Kowalski, the American people deserve to know why you're refusing this honor. What happened on March 15th, 1970? A lot of good men died. But you saved those children. You're a hero." "Heroes don't exist, Ms. Chen. Only people making impossible choices and living with the consequences." Her eyes narrowed. Something in my tone had triggered her reporter's instincts. "Mr. Kowalski, I've been researching that day. The timeline doesn't add up. Your unit wasn't supposed to be in Pubai. The mission was aborted." My blood turned to ice water. "Where did you hear that?" "I have sources in the Pentagon. Someone leaked the original communications logs. There was an abort order issued at 0847 hours. Your unit received it, but proceeded anyway. That's not heroism, Mr. Kowalski. That's insubordination." The world tilted on its axis. After 54 years, the truth was crawling out of its grave like a zombie in a B-movie. But Chen didn't understand what she was digging up. She didn't know about Morrison's children, about the lives that would be destroyed when the world learned their father had died as a result of his own disobedience. "You don't understand what you're talking about," I said. "Then help me understand. Why did your commanding officer ignore a direct order? What was he hiding?" She thought Morrison was the villain in this story. She thought I was protecting myself. The irony was almost funny, if irony could be funny when it tasted like grave dirt and broken promises. "Ms. Chen, some stories are better left buried. The public has a right to know. If Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was a war criminal, he wasn't." The words came out like rifle shots. "James Morrison was the finest man I ever served under. He died saving those children. By disobeying orders, by putting his men at risk. Mr. Kowalski, how many soldiers died because of his decision?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. She was asking the right questions, but she was asking them 54 years too late. The answers would destroy a family that had already given enough to their country. 6, I whispered. 6 men died that day. Chen's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. Because Morrison ignored the abort order? Because war is hell, and good men die for noble reasons, and sometimes the truth is a luxury the living can't afford. She leaned forward, sensing victory. "Mr. Kowalski, are you saying that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's heroic death was actually the result of his own military misconduct? That he got his own men killed?" The question detonated in my chest like a mortar round. For 54 years I'd carried the weight of that day, the knowledge that Morrison's heroism was inseparable from his disobedience. I'd watched his children grow up believing their father was a perfect soldier, a model officer, A man worthy of emulation. The truth would destroy that. The truth would reveal that James Morrison had died because he chose 17 Vietnamese children over military protocol. The truth would make him human. Get out, I said. Mr. Kowalski, get out. She left, but she'd be back. They all would. The story was too good, the contradiction too juicy. A war hero refusing his medal because his commanding officer was really an insubordinate officer who got his own men killed. The headlines wrote themselves. I sat in my chair and stared at the Congressional Medal of Honor lying on my carpet like a golden accusation. They wanted to honor me for a day when everything went wrong, when good men died because sometimes doing the right thing means breaking every rule you've ever sworn to uphold. 3 hours later, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Check your email. You need to see this. J.C. Jessica Chen. The Vulture had found something. I opened my laptop with hands that shook like autumn leaves. Her email contained a single attachment, a scanned document marked classified. In faded red ink. The header read, After Action Report, Firebase, Charlie, March 15th, 1970, Eyes Only. It wasn't Morrison's real report. This was something else entirely. As I read, my blood turned to slush. The document was signed by Colonel Robert Hayes, Morrison's commanding officer. It detailed intelligence that had come in at 8:30 hours on March 15th. Credible reports that Phu Bai was being used as a staging ground for a major Viet Cong offensive. The abort order hadn't been issued to protect American forces from walking into an ambush. It had been issued because command wanted the village destroyed by airstrikes. 17 children would have been vaporized by American bombs if Morrison had followed orders. He hadn't just disobeyed. He'd prevented a war crime. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, but it was already ringing. You son of a bitch, Chen's voice crackled through the speaker. You've been sitting on this for 50 years. Morrison wasn't just insubordinate. He stopped a massacre. Where did you get this? Pentagon source. Someone finally grew a conscience. Frank, do you understand what this means? Your friend didn't just save those kids from the Viet Cong. He saved them. From us, the room spun like a carnival ride. For 5 decades, I'd believed Morrison had died because he'd chosen compassion over orders. But the truth was infinitely more complex. He died because he'd chosen humanity over military expedients, because he'd refused to be complicit in the slaughter of innocents. The airstrikes, I whispered. What happened to them? Delayed by 47 minutes due to radio complications. By the time the bombers arrived, your unit had already extracted the civilians and engaged the enemy. The village was destroyed, but it was empty except for dead Viet Cong fighters. Morrison had known. Somehow he'd known exactly what the abort order really meant. That's why his face had drained of color when he'd received the transmission. That's why he'd looked at me with those suddenly ancient eyes. Ms. Chen, you can't publish this. Like hell I can't. This is the story of the century, a military cover-up that's lasted half a century. An American officer who died preventing his own government from committing war crimes. Think about what you're doing. Morrison's family will finally know the truth about their father, that he wasn't just a hero. He was a man who chose his conscience over his career, his life over his silence. She was right, but that didn't make it easier. The truth would vindicate Morrison completely, would transform him from a complex figure into an unambiguous saint. But it would also shatter everything his children thought they knew about the war their father had died fighting. Chen hung up before I could respond. Within minutes, my phone was ringing again, but this time the caller ID showed a number I recognized all too well. Frank? General James Morrison Jr.'s voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. In the background, I could hear the familiar sounds of the Pentagon, the controlled chaos of a military machine that never slept. Jimmy. Frank, I just got a very interesting call from a Washington Post reporter. She says she has classified documents about Dad's last mission. She says you've been protecting him from something bigger than insubordination. My throat felt like sandpaper. Jimmy, she says Dad died preventing a war crime. She says Command wanted to bomb that village with those children still inside. The silence stretched between us like a minefield. When Jimmy spoke again, his voice was hollow, distant. Frank, I need to know. Is it true? Yes. The word escaped before I could stop it, carrying with it 54 years of buried anguish. Morrison hadn't just been a good soldier making a tough choice. He'd been a guardian angel standing between innocent children and American bombs. Jesus Christ, Jimmy whispered. All these years, I thought he'd just made a tactical error. I thought he'd gotten his men killed for nothing. He got his men killed saving 17 children from being incinerated by their own Air Force. There's a difference. I could hear Jimmy crying now, great shuddering sobs that carried decades of confusion and guilt. He'd spent his entire career trying to live up to his father's reputation, never knowing that reputation was built on a foundation of moral courage that went deeper than any medal could honor. Frank, why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you let me spend 40 years thinking Dad was just another dead soldier? Because your father asked me not to. Because he knew what the truth would cost. Not just him, but everyone who'd served in that war. He knew that if word got out that American officers were preventing war crimes, it would raise questions about all the times they didn't. And now? Now. It doesn't matter. The truth is coming out whether we want it to or not. Chen has documents, sources, evidence. By tomorrow morning, the whole world will know that James Morrison died because he refused to let children be murdered in America's name. Jimmy was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, resolved. Frank, what do you need me to do? Nothing. Just be proud of your father, not for the reasons you thought, but for who he really was. What about you? What about the medal? I looked at the Congressional Medal of Honor, still lying on my carpet like a golden accusation. Tomorrow the ceremony would be canceled. Tomorrow the whole narrative would change. Instead of honoring my heroism, they'd be dealing with the revelation that the American military had planned to bomb a village full of children in 1970. The medal was never about me, Jimmy. It was about that day, about what your father did. And now the world will finally understand what really happened. After Jimmy hung up, I sat in my chair and waited for the storm to break. My phone buzzed constantly. Reporters, Pentagon officials, old soldiers who'd heard whispers of the story. That was about to reshape everything they thought they knew about Vietnam. But I didn't answer. I just sat in the gathering darkness, holding Morrison's real report in my hands, thinking about the man who'd saved 17 children and died protecting the secret that could have destroyed the military he'd sworn to serve. Opened the door to find a woman in her 70s, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the Denver wind. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to military protocol. Behind her stood a man in his 50s wearing dress blues adorned with enough ribbons to outfit a parade. Mr. Kowalski? The woman's voice carried the soft accent of Virginia aristocracy. I'm Margaret Morrison. This is my son, James. Morrison's widow. Morrison's son. Standing on my doorstep like ghosts made flesh, their eyes carrying the weight of a truth that was about to destroy their world. Mrs. Morrison, General. I stepped aside, gesturing them into my modest living room. I've been expecting you. Margaret Morrison moved with the grace of a woman who'd spent decades at military functions, her eyes taking in the sparse furnishings, the empty bourbon bottles, the Congressional Medal lying abandoned on the floor. She picked up the medal and held it to the light, her fingers tracing its edges like a rosary. 54 years, she said softly. 54 years I've wondered what really happened that day. What my husband died for. What you've been hiding. Jimmy, General Morrison now, stood at attention despite being in my civilian living room. He'd inherited his father's bearing, his sense of duty, but his eyes held a pain that Morrison's never had. The pain of a man who'd spent his life trying to live up to a legend, never knowing the legend was built on a lie of omission. "Ma'am, your husband was a hero. Yes, I know. Everyone's told me that for 5 decades. But heroes don't usually require 50 years of silence from their sergeants. Heroes don't usually inspire their men to refuse the Congressional Medal of Honor." She sat down heavily in my threadbare armchair, still clutching the medal. For the first time since I'd known her, Margaret Morrison looked old. "Mrs. Morrison, some truths are too heavy for the living to carry, and some lies are heavier." Her voice carried the steel that had helped her raise 2 children alone, that had sustained her through decades of wondering why her husband's last mission felt like an unfinished symphony. "Mr. Kowalski, I've read the classified report. I know about the airstrikes. I know James died preventing a war crime." The words hit me like artillery fire. She knew. They both knew. The secret I'd carried for 54 years was already spreading, like wildfire through the family that had paid the highest price for Morrison's conscience. "How?" Jimmy stepped forward, his dress blues catching the afternoon light streaming through my windows. "Ms. Chen contacted us before she contacted you. Professional courtesy, she said. She wanted us to know what she was about to publish. We came here to ask you not to let our father's sacrifice be turned into a political football," Margaret said, her voice steady, despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "We came to ask you to help us tell his story the right way." I sat down across from them, these 2 people who'd lived their entire lives in the shadow of a man whose true heroism they were only now beginning to understand. Morrison's widow and his son, both carrying the DNA of moral courage that had gotten their husband and father killed. "Mrs. Morrison, I don't know how to tell his story. I've been running from it for 54 years. "Then stop running." Jimmy's voice carried his father's authority, the command presence that had made Morrison such an effective leader. "Dad died protecting those children. He died protecting his men, and he died protecting you. The least you can do is make sure the world understands why." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes locked on mine with an intensity that reminded me painfully of Morrison in those final moments. "Mr. Kowalski, my husband left me with 2 children and a hero's legacy. But he also left me with questions that have haunted me for 5 decades. Why did he look so sad in his last letter home? Why did he write about making peace with God? Why did he tell me to be proud of him no matter what anyone said?" The letter. I'd forgotten about Morrison's final letter to his wife, written the night before the mission that would kill him. He'd known, even then, that he was walking into a situation that would test every principle he'd ever held sacred. "He knew what was coming," I said quietly. "The intelligence reports about the planned airstrikes had been circulating for days. He knew command was prepared to sacrifice those children to eliminate a Viet Cong staging area. And he couldn't live with that. No, ma'am, he couldn't." Jimmy moved to the window, his silhouette framed against the Denver skyline. "Dad always said a soldier's first duty was to his conscience, then to his country, then to his commanding officer. I thought it was just West Point philosophy. I didn't realize he'd died proving it. Your father saved 17 children from being incinerated by American bombs," I said. "But he also saved something else. He saved the soul of every man in his unit. He made sure we could all go home knowing we'd fought for something bigger than politics or strategy or military objectives." Margaret wiped her eyes with a handkerchief that looked older than either of her children. "The reporter, Ms. Chen, she says the story will break tomorrow morning. Front page of the Washington Post." "Yes, ma'am. And you? What will you do when the world learns the truth?" I looked at the Congressional Medal in her hands, thought about the ceremony I'd refused, the honor I'd rejected. Tomorrow, when Chen's story broke, everything would change. Morrison would be vindicated, elevated from complex war hero to unambiguous, moral giant. The children he'd saved would finally know his name. The men who'd died with him would be remembered not as victims of poor judgment, but as casualties of conscience. "I'll tell them about your husband," I said. "I'll tell them about the man who looked at 17 terrified children and decided that some orders are meant to be broken. I'll tell them about Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, who died proving that the highest form of patriotism is refusing to let your country commit atrocities in your name." Margaret smiled through her tears, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since she'd arrived. "Thank you, Mr. Kowalski. Thank you for protecting him all these years. Thank you for protecting us. Ma'am, I should have told you years ago. You deserve to know who you'd married." "I knew," she said softly. "I always knew James was capable of extraordinary things. I just didn't know how extraordinary." They left as the sun was setting, Morrison's widow and son walking into the gathering darkness with the knowledge that their husband and father had been even greater than they'd imagined. The secret that had defined my life for 54 years was finally theirs to carry, theirs to understand, theirs to be proud of. That night I called Chen and gave her the full story. I read Morrison's real report over the phone, described the look in his eyes when he'd realized what the abort order really meant, told her about the 17 children who grew up to have children of their own because a good man had chosen conscience over career. The story broke at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. My throat closed like a fist. "Jimmy, Frank, I need to know. What really happened that day?" The question I'd been dreading for 54 years, asked by the one person who had the right to know the answer. Morrison's son, the boy who'd grown up believing his father was a perfect soldier, who'd built his own military career on the foundation of that belief. "Your father was a hero, Jimmy. Never doubt that." That's not what I asked. The silence stretched between us like a tripwire. On the other end of the line, I could hear him breathing, waiting for the truth that would either destroy his world or set him free. "Jimmy, your father saved 17 children that day. Everything else is details. Details that got 6 men killed, he knew." Somehow, he'd already heard the whispers, seen the leaked documents, connected the dots that I'd spent decades keeping separate. The truth was spreading like wildfire, and there was no way to contain it now. "Your father made a choice," I said finally. "He chose to save innocent lives over following orders. He died protecting children who would have been slaughtered if we'd followed protocol. By disobeying a direct command, yes, the word hung in the air like a death sentence. I'd finally said it out loud, admitted the truth that had been eating me alive for more than half a century. James Morrison had died because he'd chosen humanity over hierarchy, compassion over command structure. Frank, why didn't you ever tell me?" The pain in his voice was worse than any physical wound I'd ever received. This was Morrison's son, the boy who'd grown up wanting to be just like his heroic father, now learning that his father's heroism was inseparable from his insubordination. "Because your father asked me not to. Because he knew what it would cost." What it would cost who? Everyone. Your family. His legacy. The men who served under him. Sometimes the truth is a grenade, Jimmy. Sometimes you have to swallow it to protect the people you love. I could hear him crying now, soft sounds that carried 54 years of grief and confusion, and finally understanding. "The medal," he said. "You're refusing it because accepting it would mean admitting what really happened. I'm refusing it because I don't deserve it. Your father does. He's the one who saved those children. He's the one who died for them. I just followed his orders. Even when those orders were illegal. Especially then. We sat in silence for a long time, 2 old soldiers connected by a secret that had shaped both our lives in ways we were only beginning to understand. Finally, Jimmy spoke again. "Frank, what do you need me to do?" "Nothing. Just remember your father as the man he was. Flawed, human, but willing to die for what was right. What about the reporters, the investigation? Let them dig. The truth will come out eventually. It always does. And when it does, I looked at the medal on my floor, at the photograph of 30 young soldiers, at the bourbon that had been my only companion through 5 decades of silence. When it does, the world will learn that James Morrison was exactly the kind of soldier we need more of, not fewer. The kind who knows that sometimes the most important orders come from your conscience, not your commanding officer. After Jimmy hung up, I sat in my chair and watched the sun set over Denver's skyline. Tomorrow, the story would break. Morrison's perfect reputation would be shattered, revealed as the complex legacy of a man who chose love over law, humanity over hierarchy. His children would survive it. They were strong, like their father. They would learn to love him not despite his flaws, but because of them. They would understand that true heroism isn't about following orders. It's about knowing when to break them. The Congressional Medal of Honor glinted in the fading light, still lying where I'd thrown it. They would rescind the award, of course. You can't give the nation's highest honor to a man whose heroism was built on his commanding officer's insubordination. But that was fine. Heroes don't need medals. They don't need recognition or parades or posthumous honors. They just need someone to remember that on March 15, 1970, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison looked at 17 terrified children and decided that some things are more important than orders. I picked up the medal and held it to the light. For just a moment, I could see Morrison's face reflected in its golden surface. Not the perfect soldier from the official portraits, but the real man. The one who died protecting innocence. The one who'd trusted me to carry his secret until the world was ready to understand that sometimes disobedience is the highest form of duty. Tomorrow, I would call a press conference. I would tell them everything. I would read Morrison's reel, report aloud, the one that had been hidden in my safety deposit box for 54 years. I would make sure the world knew that the children lived because a good man chose to break bad orders. And then, finally, I would be able to sleep without the weight of his sacrifice crushing my chest every night. The medal felt lighter in my hands, now, as if the truth had burned away everything except what mattered. James Morrison had been dead for 54 years, but his final order was still in effect. Get the children out. Mission accomplished, sir. Mission finally, truly accomplished.